Alright, greetings everyone. This is Dr. Brandon Brown, and I am making this tutorial video on how to set up an environment for most of my classes that I teach at both Coastline College and Cal Poly Pomona. I'm going to be using the CST-158 Server Plus Lab topology for this. So for those students who are in my 158 class, well, you're in luck, because I'm going to basically show you how to do the optional lab setups in this tutorial video. So I'm using VMware Workstation 15.5. You can set this up in Google Cloud, AWS, Azure. I'm not going over that in this video. I highly suggest that you learn how to do so if you are using or you are have limitations on your hardware. Let me state this first and foremost. I am using some really beefy hardware, and I'll be able to run this environment with a lot of really higher end resources, and I'm going to make things look easy. Some of you, especially for my Cal Poly students, that may not have up-to-date hardware or some older hardware, you might struggle with this. I'm not going to lie to you. Now, am I telling you to go out and buy brand new hardware? No, I am not. Can you do this on hardware that is a little bit older? Yeah, you can. You may have to set this up, and you might only be able to run 1 or 2 VMs at a time. You might not be able to run the entire environment like I will be doing so. So keep that in mind. But to give you an idea of what I am running, alright, I have a Windows 10 machine with an AMD Ryzen 5 1600 hex core, 3.2 gigahertz per core, and actually 2 cores per processor. So I have 12 cores essentially. 24 gigs of RAM. I want to run more RAM. I'll probably be buying that in the next few months. I have 2 disks on my system. I have one SSD that's a terabyte, and I have one HDD 7200 RPM that is a terabyte as well. So I'm going to be setting these up to where they run on the SSD for the purposes of this course. And most of you who have a single hard disk, this will look very similar during setup. I thought about setting it up and putting them, separating the the compute on the SSD and the hard disks on the HDD, but I thought that might be confusing, so I'm not going to do that. Alright, so launch VMware Workstation. We're going to do a File, New Virtual Machine, Custom 15.x. Again, if you're doing this in Google Cloud or AWS, you'll set up your shell to their parameters, and also do not forget to set up a virtual private network. A virtual private cloud (VPC) for your network. Alright, this is going to be Microsoft Windows. I select Windows Server 2016 because there is not a 2019 option, unfortunately, in VMware. I don't know why, but there's not. If you are using some of my classes, I allow you to use 2016. You can install 2016 instead of 2019 because 2016 is still used, and that's perfectly fine. Alright, so I'm going to change the name here, because according to this lab, this is my static IP. Looks like I have a little bit of a problem there. Let me fix that. Okay, that should fix that. And it does. And everything else is pretty much default. The UEFI, 2-in-1. I am going to give it more RAM. I'm going to give it 4096. I'll give it 4 gigs of RAM instead of 2. Can you get by with 2? Yes, you can. It's going to run really slow. Again, how much RAM you have in your system will dictate that. You always want to leave some RAM for your host system. All right. Now I have 24 gigs of RAM. If I give my host system 8 and I don't go over 16 gigs of RAM, I'm perfectly fine. 4 for 2 Windows systems and then 2 for a Linux system. That's 10 gigs. I'm not going to run into any problems. That's one of the best things you can do for your home system. The more RAM you can give it, the better performance. I'm going to use NAT, and I'm going to later on here in this video, I'm going to switch my IP schema for the NAT network, and I'll show you how to do that in VMware. LSI logic, SCSI. We're going to create a new virtual disk. We're going to keep it at 60 gigabytes. It will not reserve 60 full gigabytes. It will grow. I'm going to split it into multiple files. I'm going to go ahead and keep the disk default. This is, again, it's going to put it on my SSD. I can migrate that later if I want to. And I'm going to click finish. And now, if you look where this is, it goes to your documents, your username, in virtual machines directory, and that's where I have my settings. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this process, but this time I'm going to name it DHCP. I know it's named 2016, but I'm going to install 2019 on the operating system. So same thing, file, new virtual machine. I'm going to go through it really fast this time. 15, install it later. Windows 2016. I'm going to name it dash DHCP. I could name this to 2019 if I wanted to. It's completely 100% arbitrary. Let's just do that for now. And click next. UEFI 2.1. Let's change the RAM to 4096. Give it 4 gigs. Again, this is for our second server. Put it on the NAT network. LSI. SCSI. New virtual disk. Keep that the same. And keep that default. And we'll click finish. And you'll see that we now have 2 virtual machines up here. Alright, one's called 2016, one calls 2019. I can go ahead and rename this if I want to. All I have to do is right click and do the rename. I can change that to 2019 if I want to. And that'll rename everything. Alright. Alright, and then now I just need to make my Fedora box. So one last one, new virtual machine, install later. This time it's going to be Linux, and it's going to be Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Fedora. I don't know if they have a Fedora option in here. Oh, they do. Fedora 64-bit. So I'm going to use that as my Linux distro. I'm just going to call it Fedora. I'm going to give it 1 processor, 2 cores. And default is fine for the RAM on Fedora. It's going to be on NAT, LSI, SCSI, create new disk. It only needs to have 20 gigs. That's fine. Again, default, multiple files, Fedora VMDK, and finish. And it'll pop up here. All right. So we'll take care of installation in later videos. But there is one thing I do want to show, because I'm going to standardize all of my homework and labs and everything else across all my classes to this IP schema, 192.168.1. All right. And let me go ahead, and you needed to do a little bit of a check here. So pull up a command prompt. And this may be different for everyone. So do ipconfig, and if you're running Linux, it's ifconfig or the appropriate command depending on your distro. I'm going to pipe that so I can page it. And I'm going to make sure I don't have 192.168.1 network anywhere. So I'm going to look at my network interface cards. Alright, my VMnet 1, which is my host. VMnet 8 is your NAT network. So this is the one we're going to change. But I'll show you how to do that here in a second. But we want to make sure that we do not have any conflicts. Oh, and it looks like I do. So it looks like my home network is going to conflict with that. So I'm not going to be able to do this on my Wi-Fi network. So if you're doing that, you want to switch this to 10, 192.168.10. That's perfectly fine. All right. So I'm going to make that caveat right now that I'm switching it to 10, from 1 to 10. And a lot of people might have this problem. So if you change that, that's perfectly fine as long as it is changed across the board. So for a lot of my homeworks, I have this set up in Coastline's NetLab environment to where it's 192.168.1. I'm going to set up in my home environment for 192.168.10. And a lot of you may have this problem because you might have your home network that will overlap. And if you have .10 set up there instead, you can go to .100 or whatever you want to. Just ensure that you make note of those changes. For a lot of my assignments, I just require screenshots. I don't really care about the IP address. Just make a quick denotation that hey, my IP schema has changed from 192.168.1 to whatever, and that will be totally fine. Not a problem. So I'm going to change mine to .10. Let me show you how to do that. So in VMware, you have this handy dandy little tool called Virtual Network Editor. Bring that up. And I'm going to change the IP schema of my virtual network editor. Okay. So I might come down here and say change settings where the administrator shield is. I'm going to highlight the NAT network. I'm going to change the subnet ID to 10. And that's about it. I'm going to change this DHCP settings from 75 to 10. Now I'm going to set these really high because for this lab I have to set up DHCP on my Windows servers later on. And so I'm only going to set this at like say 245. Actually, I don't want to do that. Let's see, 16, 240, 241, 241 to 254. Yeah, that falls along subnet lines. And that's good. So close that. That looks good. That looks good. We're going to hit apply. That'll take a minute because it's got to restart all the services. There you go, and click OK, and done. So now when I bring any type of virtual machine up in the environment, it will come up as a DHCP. It will go onto that network. Now, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to potentially disable that later on in some of my labs, and I'll come across and I'll show you that. So that it gets a DHCP address from this server instead of this server. But in the next labs that I'm going to show, for at least for my 158 class, is how to install 2019. So until then, thank you very much for tuning in. This is Dr. Brown, signing off.